Let me know if I speak too fast. I speak in English as an Italian, would speak in Italian. So if I speak too fast, let me know. I would say I'm totally delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Anna. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to talk about metaphysics, a subject I really love, and I hope I'll make it interesting enough for all of you online and in person. I'll just stand because I feel I connect more with the audience, if that's okay with you. I want to talk about power in nature. Yes, no pressure from Anna. It is about the construction of the world, you know, it all hangs together. But don't we all care about these kind of questions in our daily life? So I want to start with an assumption that I hope we can share, that the world, the universe as we find it, is somehow held together, is somehow unified by relations among what there is. And I want to make the assumption that these relations that unify what there is are causal relations. Causation has been said to be the cement of the universe, the glue of the universe, not just what holds things together, but that without which things would fall apart. So causation has been treated in the analytic tradition as a really core concept in metaphysics, the thing without which there would be just a sequence of dots and things, but not the universe as such. So of course, for us metaphysicians, it's a really key task to try to make sense of causation, try to give a good account of it, if we believe that causation has a special role of holding things together. And once we agree that causation does that, though, we need to explain, and that's where the real hard work is, what is a causal mechanism. So, you know, you throw a ball that hits another ball. Okay, the first ball causes the second ball to move. You drop a glass and the glass breaks. Or, you know, you have a magnet and you put it next to metal and that magnet attracts metal. These are all examples of causal connections in the world. We can all agree that they happen, but what we need to say is, what is it that explains? What is it that is in common? What is the mechanism that explains all these causal connections in the world? And not only how they work, but what keeps them working. You know, there is some sense of regularity in these causal happenings. You know, you expect that every time you drop a glass, it's going to break if it is glass on a hard surface. So, you know, what is the causal mechanism behind all these instances of causation, and what's it that keeps them going the same way all the time? And this is where metaphysicians disagree. So we may all agree the universe is causally connected, but then we really draw blood on what it is that keeps things causally connected. And here I want to contrast two positions in contemporary metaphysics that give two very different explanations of these causal connections in the world. So I want to contrast what historically has been identified as a Humean position, because it's been made famous by the British philosopher David Hume, Humean causation, with what I call powerful causation. And you probably guessed that I'm going to be on the side of the powerful causation theorists. So the Humeans, and nowadays the neo-Humeans, can agree with us that yes, causation holds the universe together, but their understanding of causation is very minimalist. And you can see it on the slide. For them, all that causation consists is simply regularity, contiguity, succession in time. So the Humeans would say, yes, of course, you know, you drop a glass, the glass breaks. So you dropping the glass causes the glass to break. But what happens there is simply that there is the dropping of the glass and then the breaking of the glass that are contiguous in time. One happens before the other contiguously. And that's all. The rest is our projections, our mental projections on the world, you know, so we say more, we call it causation, but all there is just this sequence of events. Now, this is Humean / Neumannian causation, to be contrasted with what I call powerful causation that says, no, whenever there is some causal event, that happens because there are some causal powers in place that exercise, and their exercise is what explains causation. Now, the key of this account is that, according to the powerful causation theorist, causation is not in the mind, it's in the world, is more than simply sequencing time of events, and that more has to do with the presence of these entities, which we call causal powers. Causal powers, and this is the essential thing I want to say, are dynamic entities. So they are dynamic in the sense that they are such that they can bring about the next event. So it's not that there is an event and then there is another event. There are objects in the world endowed with causal powers, and these causal powers being dynamic, they move the universe forward to the next step, to the next stage, according to certain rules or laws of nature, we could say. So I think this is a key difference between the neo-Humeans and the Humeans. So one of the key differences that, yes, we all agree causation is fundamental as in the world, but they think causation can be kind of reduced to the passage of time. We think, no, causation has to do with dynamic entities bringing about the next stage in the history of the universe. Now, of course, if you believe in powerful causation, then the key task is to explain what are these causal powers. And I already gave you some examples. So think of a magnet. A magnet has magnetic power in that it can attract metal. Think of a glass. A glass is fragile. It can break if struck in appropriate conditions. Think of water as having the power to dissolve powders in water. So the universe, think of mass, spin, and charge, go fundamental in the history of the world, go biology if you are interested like Anna in biology. The world seems to be rich of all these kind of properties that we characterize as causal powers. So causal powers, the first thing I want to say, are properties. They're qualities, they're characteristic of things. We, artifacts, natural entities, living, not living, all have causal powers. Now, these causal powers are properties of a special kind. Why? Because they can exist either as inactive, and by which I mean doing nothing, okay, or active, activated, doing something. And again, think of the magnet. That's a really simple case. The magnet has the magnetic power, but unless there is metal in the proximity, nothing happens, just there, it's just inactive. Or think of a glass that is fragile, but nobody drops it and nothing happens to the glass. So these properties are special, metaphysically special, because they can exist in a state of inactivity, i.e. doing nothing, or they can be doing something. And then when they're doing something, they or their possessor brings about change. So again, let's go back to our example of magnetism. The magnet has magnetic power. Magnetic power is a property of the magnet. But if there is no metal in the proximity, then nothing happens. But then if there is metal in the proximity, the magnet is going to attract this metal to move forward, to move closer to the magnet. So here is really the important thing I want to say. This property are dynamic in the sense that they seem to be able to kind of go from one state to another. And that's what we need to explain. How is it that these properties can go from one state to the other? Now, we metaphysicians, I say me too, have a simple trick to do that. And I have it in very general terms on the slide. So we think that causal powers are such that a type of power is essentially defined by the type of change that it brings about. So to put it simply, we say what a power is defined by the type of change that power can bring about. So magnetism is, by definition, the capacity of something to, let's say, attract metal. Or to repel another magnet, and so on and so forth. So there is an essential connection between the type of property and the type of change that the property can bring about when active. And this, in very simple terms, is supposed to be the key the key explanation of how causal powers can explain causation. So we wanted to know, how is it that change comes about in the world? What is it that moves the universe from one state to another? We say it's because there are causal powers. Causal powers are such that they are defined by the type of change they bring about. So drop out causal powers in the constitution of the universe and you have change, because causal powers are just those things that bring about change. So I'm simplifying the story a little bit, but this is really the essence of the idea that the universe is causally unified because things in the universe possess these special properties that can go from inactive to active, and when they're active, they bring about change. But now I want to play, as we say in English, the devil's advocate and push against this idea. How is it that these properties do that, right? How is it that, you know, the magnet is there dormant, and then you put next to it a bit of metal and the magnet gets activated in its magnetism and attracts metal? So the how is really the key question. The how is a question that really divides philosophers. So some philosophers say that the how power operates is so difficult to explain that we should be suspicious about them, skeptical about them, maybe even eliminate them from the ontology because we cannot explain how they operate. Other philosophers say, no, causal powers are really the central explanatory entity in the universe, so we should not try to explain them, but use them to explain everything else. So you see the switch. Some say, oh, powers themselves have to be explained. We don't have a good explanation. Let's throw them away. Others say, no, powers, you know, are difficult to explain, but they're really useful for science. So let's keep them and try to work on them. Okay, that's the quotation that you see on the PowerPoint is from someone who has worked a lot on powers in Germany, based in Germany, Barbara Wette. She contrasts the Humean and the anti-Humean, so the Humean and the powerful metaphysicians on the topic that for the powerful metaphysician, the powers are essential explanants, so does explanatory work. For the Humeans, they are just a really difficult thing to explain. They are themselves the object of explanation. And I come here to someone who I hope is dear and known to you, Molière, who really beautifully represented in a literally way the problem. People did not talk about causal powers as much then, but it's precisely the issue here. So why can opium put people to sleep? Because it has the power to put people to sleep, right? Yes, there is a causal event. You take opium and you fall asleep. There is an explanation. Opium has causal powers to put people to sleep. But are we happy with that explanation? No. And that's why it is a caricature of a bad doctor who doesn't know what to do. Okay. So what I'm saying is that it's really not enough to say that causal powers, once they are in the picture, they can just explain change and therefore give an account of causation. It's kind of a lazy perspective, okay? I like it, I want to defend it, but I think we need to really do work to make sense of it. Otherwise, Molière is right, you know, I mean, it's just magic, metaphysical magic, how powers can do what they do. So, may we find a solution in the way powers are described. So remember, powers can exist in nature as inactive, but they can become active and bring about change. So we want to know how something that is inactive gets activated, and that is the puzzle. Now, one might say, oh, well, they get activated because they're dynamic entities. That's in their nature. They are dynamic. Things that are dynamic change. But that's not good, I say, because saying that powers are dynamic entities describes them, but doesn't explain for a metaphysician how they do what they do. Do you feel the force of the problem? So you could then try another direction. You could say, oh, well, powers do what they do because there are certain circumstances in the environment that make them become active. So, for example, take things with the magnet. I put metal next to the magnet. The circumstances within which the magnet finds itself are such that the magnetism of the magnet gets activated. So maybe the explanation of why powers get activated has to do with the environment. We put them in the right place and they do what they do. And equally, think of a different case, the one of the glass that is fragile. The glass is fragile, nothing happens, but then you drop it on the floor and the impact, the hard floor, makes it manifest its fragility and the glass breaks. So one could say that, okay, yes, so powers work, they're dynamic entities that go from inactive to active depending on the circumstances where they find themselves. But here is why I don't think it's a good reply. I don't know if you can see the joke, okay? So the idea is striking, miracle, breaking of the glass, okay? So the idea here is that if you try to explain what happens, what makes the powers become active by saying that it is the external stimulus, you kind of skip the important part of the story, okay, how? Okay, how is it that you just locate the power in a certain environment and the power does what it does? Again, it's a poor explanation. It's a bit of a miracle. So step 2 should be explained a bit better, namely, you strike the glass breaks. What happens in the middle? Okay, and I go as far as saying the done, the whore, i.e., we should look inside the powers, not outside the powers. We should look into what its properties are, not in the circumstances. Why should we look within the power? Why is not enough to say that it's the circumstances that get the powers doing what they do? 2 problems. So if we say that powers are what causes change in the world, so they're the dynamic parts of the world, but then we say that they need to be triggered to be active by something external to them, we kind of deprive them now of causal power because they sit there and the circumstances kind of kick them into action. The magnet does nothing, the metal comes around, and then the magnet gets activated. Well, that seems like that all the work is done by the environment, not by the magnetism of the magnet. So do you see what I'm saying? It's kind of, if we have put the powers into the picture and we put them in our construction of the world to do some work, and then we kind of delegate that work to the environment, that seems to have deprived the powers of causal power. So it's a drainage of power. But you can also think of a second problem. So suppose that the powers do what they do because of the circumstances. But then why do the circumstances act on the powers? And then you generate the potential regress of circumstances. Where do you stop? So the magnet becomes active in attracting metal because the metal is nearby. But what brought the metal nearby? And then, that picture where you have everything, going down on, unlimitedly on the shoulder of something that is nowhere because it's so deep. So I want to say that we need to look within the nature of the power, because if we look without, we don't find a solution to our problem. But I want to say the prospects, as I see them, of finding a solution by looking inside the nature of the power are not as optimistic as one might want to have them, because I want to say that, and this is here I'm beginning to tell you something that is different from views in the literature. We cannot know what a power is, what is inside the nature of the power. Why don't we? Why cannot we? Because what we know in nature, and you're scientists and philosophers of science and mathematics and biology, you know better than me, we find out about the world by causally interacting with the world, and then we measure the world, we interact and measure the world. But in the case of the causal powers, what we do is to interact with the manifestation or exercise. So we see the glass breaking, we see the metal attracting, we can measure all these things, we observe and measure all these things, but we not go inside the magnetism, inside, metaphorically speaking, the magnetism of the magnet, and try to see how does it work? because all we have epistemically access to is what we can observe and measure, and we cannot enter the nature of a property and measure that. So I think there is a real problem. I mean, both a problem from an empirical point of view, we cannot just, as I say, enter and measure the nature of a power, but also a metaphysical problem. We cannot model powers metaphysically. We cannot create hypotheses about the nature of powers that can really explain how things work. And why do I say that? Well, of course, my claim may be falsified in the future, but as things are in contemporary metaphysics, where we've been thinking about powers for decades, and if you count from Aristotle's time, millennia, nobody has been successful in doing that. So that's why there are reasons for thinking that maybe it's not possible to successfully model the metaphysics of causal powers. And if all this is true, what I want to say is that powers are to us metaphysically black boxes. So, we place them somewhere, they do what they do, but that miracle that I was showing you here is just something we cannot give an explanation of. So step 2 is bound to remain mysterious to us. Okay, so so where are we now in our thinking about the world? So I say, well, suppose we agree that causation is important. Suppose that we want to explain it better than Hume did. Suppose we posit causal powers to explain them, to explain causation. Well, once we make that move, we have to pay a price, a metaphysical cost, a philosophical cost. And that cost is to posit within our ontology, within our construction of the world, an entity that in philosophy we call primitive. So primitive means an entity that cannot be explained by anything simpler than itself or further than itself. It's like bedrock, we say in English. There is nothing beyond it that we can use to explain it. So what I'm saying is that if this is if causation explaining in terms of causal powers, but causal powers are primitive, then we introduce a primitive in our ontology. A primitive is a cost, so we need to assess whether it's still worth having causal powers in our picture, or we should declare game over. Let's go Humean. Now, the claim I want to endorse here is that we still want causal power, we still need causal powers. And I'm going to rely on the wise words of a philosopher of science, whom I imagine you know, Nancy Cartwright, a colleague of mine, in fact. I think one of the most lovely and as well as distinguished philosophers of science, at least in the Anglo-American world. And she wrote a paper which has this really nice title, Aristotelian Powers. Without them, what would modern science do? So I'm saying, in case that's not a familiar name to you, that Nancy is the person who replaced Popper at LSE in London when Popper retired. So for philosophy of science is a person that carries a lot of kind of authority, a lot of a lot of wisdom, let's say, rather than authority. That sounds a lot better. And she wrote, Aristotelian powers we maintain, with her co-author John Pemberton, are part of the basic ontology of nature, at least as nature is pictured through the lens of modern science. Okay, so if we are scientific about understanding the world, we need causal powers, not just causal powers, Aristotelian causal powers, she says. We defend the right powers not on general metaphysical grounds, but rather show their importance for making sense of contemporary scientific practice. Powers are the best way to make sense of familiar methods for inferring and testing causal claims in contemporary science, from physics to economics. So here's someone really committed to the fact that we need causal powers. Maybe we have to pay this cost of having a private in the ontology, but it's worth paying the cost because the claim is really strong. We couldn't do modern science without them. And she proceeds saying, our powers are Aristotelian in that we suppose that what a power does when exercised is in the nature of that power. So this is different words by the same concept that I was trying to explain before. She's saying whatever powers do, we need to find an explanation of what they do within their nature. So we have to look inside, okay, if we can. My approach is we cannot, okay? But she says that's where we need to look to understand what powers do what they do. And then she addresses, you know, the skepticism of the anti-power philosophers who, as she writes, the scientific revolutionaries made fun of this kind of Aristotelianism. But she says we, by contrast, embrace the proliferation of powers and argue that it neither undermines scientific explanation nor detracts from the achievements of science. So power to the powers, that's the message, okay? So I've been presenting to you what the real problem, I think, is for those who believe in causal powers. And I am going now to enter this series of difficulties with this kind of idea that I'm very happy to test, you know, with your intuitions, that causal powers are actually useful for science. So if they are useful for science, we need to find a way of model them, to think about them philosophically. So here is the argument this is a view that I want to present. I want to say that, yes, if we try to explain causation in terms of causal powers, we introduce a primitive in our system. It is a primitive in the sense that there is nothing further that we can use to explain it. So it remains to us a black box. We cannot really understand the nature of powers. But even if we are in that position, we should still not throw the power, not eliminate powers from our ontology, rather keep them in our ontology because they're useful. What are they useful for? Prediction. And science likes prediction, so scientists should like causal powers. So the bigger picture now is this. With respect to causal powers, I think we have reasons to be realist about them. So think that they really exist in nature. Both metaphysics, but especially physics and science in general, seems to think that, scientists rather than science in general, posit things that fit this description of causal powers. But we should also be humble, have metaphysical humility about causal powers, and accept that we can't really work out what is within their nature. We cannot reduce them, we cannot explain them in terms of something simpler. So we should just buy them as a primitive in our ontology, but put them to work, make something of them, use them for prediction, and that is useful. So there is an explanatory utility to powers, even if there is a kind of mystery that they bring, or limitation rather, that they bring to our understanding of nature. And I'm going to now try to show you a little bit of what has been done in philosophy in trying to open that causal box, that kind of black box. So I said we cannot open it. I just made the claim, but not, and I said we cannot because empirically we can only know about things we interact with and measure. But in the case of powers, we only measure the manifestation, exercise, or effect, but not the power itself. And then I said that there is also a metaphysical argument. The metaphysical argument against opening the box is that we have tried and failed. And I want to show you some examples of how we tried and failed. And maybe some of you will have further ideas, you know, maybe it's an open game. So there are a number of attempts, but I'm just going to concentrate here on two. So some metaphysicians think that what is interesting about powers is that there are properties that are somehow directed. So in the following sense, magnetism is directed towards attracting or repelling according to the circumstances. Fragility is directed towards breaking in certain circumstances. Solubility is directed towards solving certain material in certain circumstances. So some metaphysicians say, oh, a power is, when we say a power is essentially defined by the type of change it brings about, what we mean is that that power is directed towards that change. It's a property that has a direction, has directionality. It just goes in a certain way when the circumstances are right. And so maybe that's a key, that's a black box explanation. We understand how powers go from inactive to active because they are directed properties. But again, saying that powers are directed properties gives it a name, but not an explanation. What does it mean to say that they're directed properties? And here is something really interesting that I hope it will interest the audience. So some say that the directness of powers is just the same as the directness of mental states in relation to objects in the world. So like our mental states are about something, so I'm thinking of that chair, my mental state of thinking is about that chair, is directed towards that chair. Equally, causal powers are about things in the world. So fragility is about breaking, okay? Or magnetism is about attracting and repelling. So some metaphysicians try to open the black box with this really original idea of saying the powers are direct properties, and then they try to explain directness in terms of the aboutness of a mental state. But is that a good idea? Is it a good idea to say that there are properties of objects in the world that have an aboutness, like mental states are about something? Yes and no, I want to say. So some philosophers really think that's a fantastic explanation, okay? And there is a lot of literature on this topic. They say it's mental intentionality, physical intentionality. Intentionality is the key to the world. You know, mental and physical all have this trait, common trait, intentionality. And I made a short list there, but I think the list could be much longer, of people who are at the moment working on this idea, with the most recent book being just published this year by William Bauer. But other metaphysicians say, no way. I mean, that's really spooky to say that, you know, powers do what they do because they are about something in the world, like we do what we do because our mental states are about something in the world. That's really spooky. And that also would seem to make the world a world of souls, where everything, you know, properties of objects have intentions, like we have intentions. So it's really heated debate. And I want to say my modest opinion on this is that actually we can speak about physical intentionality, but that's a metaphor, it's not a solution. So again, I want to leave it open to you to come up with thoughts, you know, or you know, positions. You may feel inclined in favor or against this idea, but I think it's a metaphor to say that powers are about something. I'll tell you why. There are three reasons why I think it's not good to think that objects have intentions like people have intentions. First of all, is that even in the philosophy of mind, we don't really know what it is. We're not very clear about what it is to have an intention. So maybe some of you work in this area may have ideas about it, but it doesn't seem to me a very clear, understood concept. But also, suppose that we did understand it within the philosophy of mind, well, it's different to say that agents have intentions and therefore act, and saying that things in the world of properties that are intentional and therefore do what they do. So I think to me, it's a really big leap from the mental to the physical. But the other thing is that, you know, intentionality as such is not dynamic. You know, I'm thinking about the chair. So what? You know, I'm just standing here, I'm thinking about the chair. You know, it's, I think intentionality, even if it worked, doesn't really explain the dynamism of powers. You know, intentionality can lead to action. You know, I'm really thinking of that ice cream I want to eat, you know, and maybe that leads me to go to get an ice cream. Or I'm just thinking about that chair and I don't know, I do nothing. So I just think that's another issue, that intentionality doesn't give us that dynamism we're looking for when we're thinking about power. So can we do better? Well, there is at least another approach that I like to present to you, and that is the idea of that some metaphysicians have, that to be a cause is to be a producer of something. So I do not know how it works in French, but if you open up a English dictionary, there is an immediate connection between causing and producing. So a cause is something that produces something else. You tell me how it works in French. In Italian, that's not the case. I just want to say, I don't know, Lorenzo can have intuitions about it, but I mean, that connection between causing and producing, I don't think it's something that works for all languages. And even if it works for all languages, we should be really careful about going from language to the world. But according to these metaphysicians, so to cause is to produce. If powers are causes, powers are producers, you know. They are producers of change, and that's why they do what they do. So we now have an explanation of why powers do what they do. They are producers by nature, produce. But here is my pushback, okay? I hope you see that this talk is meant to be opening up problems more than offering ideas or definitive ideas. So here is the problem. So, okay, suppose that powers are producers, but even producers don't produce all the time. You know, we still have the problem. We understand that when powers are active, I mean, we can understand, we don't need to agree, but we can understand the idea that if something is by nature a producer, when it is active, is going to be producing, okay? But when it is active, you know, my problem with causal powers is that we need to explain how causal powers go from being inactive to being active. So I think here too, we don't have a solution. That dynamism that we're trying to understand cannot be modeled by this idea of production, I think. How does it doing? How do the powers go from inactive to active? And here I gave an example of a philosopher who has tried to develop this idea of powers as producers. I am very happy that Manuel is in the audience, because this is Bachmann, who thinks that if we conceive of powers as producers, we have a solution to dynamism, but then we have an incompatibility between powers and any theory of time. Okay, so that's something that I give you for further thinking. So admit powers, give up time, admit time, give up powers. That's a terrible dilemma to be in. So he says, give up powers, okay? But I say, well, that is because you're thinking of powers as producers, and that's not a good idea. Because even if you think of powers as producers, you have not resolved the dynamism issue. And in any case, why should we think of powers as producers? That's very problematic, as I'm about to say. So notice that in his own words, Bachmann, who works in Germany, so I'm trying to give you an overview, including philosophers from different traditions here, says the culprit of this incompatibility between time and powers has to do with the fact that powers are defined in terms of activity. Okay, so powers are doers, they do something, they're defined by change is an activity, so powers are defined by activity. Problem, okay, but notice, I speak to you because we just spoke about this topic before. Notice that there is a difference between activity and producing. Something can be active without producing anything. So here, there is a collapse of producing and being active. That shouldn't happen, I think. So that incompatibility between powers and time, I think, is not proven. But here is the ad hominem argument. Bachmann thinks, I too am responsible for this wrong understanding of powers as producers. He thinks I speak in my work of powers as in a quasi-agential language, i.e. I treat powers as agents, agents that produce something, and so I'm also responsible for that misunderstanding of powers that then makes powers incompatible with time. No, I want to say, yes, I think that powers are defined by their activity, but activity and productivity are different things. So I want to argue against the idea that the activity of powers is just the productivity. But secondly, I want to deny that for a power to be dynamic is for the power to be productive. Something can be dynamic without producing anything. Think of yourself going for a run. You're active, you're running, you don't produce anything. It's where, you think of yourself baking a cake, you're active and you produce something. So the problem is that I think we should differentiate activity from production, and someone like Bachmann just conflates them together. And it's not true that the exercise or manifestation of a power is productivity. That is actually a mistake. Why is it a mistake? Because if powers are essentially defined by the type of change they bring about, and we imagine that that change is produced by the power, then we have a power producing its essence. Now, this does not make sense to me because it's like saying a human being is essentially this and that, okay? And then saying, so a human being produces these features that make it be a human being. But how can it be a human being if it's actually himself producing or herself producing these features? So I think there is a confusion here. We should not think that the change that the power brings about is the product of the power's activity. It's not that there is the power, and there is the change, and these are two different things, and they are related by a relation of production. I think it's much simpler than that. When a power exercises or manifests, for example, a magnet attracts metal, it's not that the magnet produces attracting metal. The magnet is just exercising itself. So it's just doing something, what? Attracting metal. So attracting metal is the result of the exercise of the power. So the power is active, and its activity as a result attracting metal. But the attracting metal is the product, is not the exercise of the power. So I'm happy to come back to this point if I'm not making it really clear. It's a bit delicate, a bit sophisticated metaphysically. I'm simply saying a power that becomes active, the activity of a power is just the power doing what it does. It's not something numerically different from the power that is produced by the power, because that doesn't make sense, okay? It's like saying that something is what it is by producing its own essence. I mean, in some metaphysical systems that may work, but it doesn't work, I think, for what we are discussing now. So I think we should think of powers as being active and inactive, being in two possible states, on and off. A power that is inactive is a power that is off, and the power that is acting, its activity is that power doing something, but it's numerically one thing in two different states. It's not one thing producing something else, okay? That's a key, simple metaphysical idea I want to propose to you. So, as we say in English, taking stock, okay, and I'm slowly coming to my conclusions. I want to say that what we have been doing so far is to assume that we consider causation as the glue of the universe. We're trying to explain causation in dynamic terms by positing powers as that which gets causation going in the world. We have been trying to understand how a power goes from inactive to active, and by looking into the nature of the power itself, by trying to see what metaphysical hypotheses or models can be given for the inner working of a power. We have looked at two examples. One example, and these are mainstream examples. So one example is of thinking of the power doing what it does because it's somehow directed towards its activity. So it has physical intentionality, behaves like a human being in a certain mental state. And I've been giving you reasons for doubting that it's a good idea. I'm very open to your replies. You may have suggestions there. Then I looked at another example, the example of those metaphysicians who think that powers are producers of change. So they exist as inactive and they produce their activity. Their activity is a product. And I've also given you reasons to be skeptical about this, because that seems to explain nothing. I mean, about how the power changes from inactive to active, we still do not know. We only find out that when the power is active, it produces something. But even that doesn't seem right, because there are powers that are active and they produce nothing. Like your power to go for a jog, okay? You jog, but you don't produce anything. So with these two examples, and there are more examples, I wanted to show you that metaphysicians today find it really difficult to offer hypotheses that are metaphysically, philosophically strong for opening that black box. I want to say that you can tell me that I also have tried to do that unsuccessfully, and I'm happy to discuss this. So I say to quoque, but for a reason, okay? So I too have spoken about powers as being ready for action, okay? But this is only a way of speaking. It's only a metaphor, okay? There cannot be an explanation. Saying ready for action is a way of talking. It's not metaphysics. So, so you may ask me, so why did you use a metaphor if you think it's not helpful? Well, I use a metaphor for a reason, and that is the response to the tu quoque. I think we really can only use metaphors because, as I was trying to say in the beginning, causal powers are primitives. So in the sense that there is nothing more fundamental than them that they can be used to explain what they are. So that's why we're always looking at this black box without being able to open it. And then we talk about what happens inside only with metaphors, because we cannot really open it, metaphysically speaking. So yes, we can only speak about metaphors, but that's not a choice. It's just a necessity, if we want to put it that way, because we cannot appeal to anything ontologically more primitive than powers. So here is where I am. I think that powers are at the bedrock of reality. They're really foundational to reality, and that's why there is nothing more primitive than them that we can use to explain them. So their dynamism, their acting, their doing things remains primitive. But the fact that remains primitive still, I mean, it's more of a lesson to learn than a reason for dropping or eliminating powers from the ontology. So what is the lesson to learn? The lesson to learn, I think, from my metaphysical perspective, is that there is a limit to our understanding of nature. So powers are an example of that limit. You know, we cannot go beyond them. You know, there is a limitation to our understanding of nature. That's it, you know, because there are fundamental entities that we need to posit to build the world. And there are our starting point, and there is nothing before the starting point, you know, not historically speaking, metaphysically speaking. So powers are the most fundamental entities there are. They are primitive, and therefore they are epistemologically black box to us. And so in a sense, we shouldn't try further. So that's the humility part of what we're saying. I'm saying that maybe we should not try further to open that black box, because the prospects are not looking good, and they're not looking good for a good reason. Namely that maybe there is, if they're fundamental, that's it, you know, it's just bedrock, fundamental. But that is not to say that we should not use causal powers in our building of the world, in our modeling of the world, in our understanding of the world. There is a lot of positive that I want to convey to you. So I think that by thinking together about these issues, we have identified in the construction of the universe, in the building of the universe that Anna was referring to at the beginning, an element that is fundamental. There is nothing more primitive than it. So it's irreducible, it's not definable by anything else simpler than it. But these causal powers are still really useful. There are properties of objects that we can classify according to their behavior. So we know that if glasses have certain properties, you know, they're going to behave in a certain way. And so we can then we can treat glasses, champagne flute, coffee mugs, you know, china vases. We can treat them in a certain way because we have classified the type of property they have as behaving in a certain way in certain circumstances. So we can do a lot by allowing causal powers within our ontology. By learning that in nature, causal powers behave in a certain way, we can make predictions. So I predict very trivially that, you know, if I drop my iPhone, it will break, okay? So I don't drop it, okay? And that's useful to me. And, you know, now take it in a more serious way. There is a lot of things we can do. Laws of nature can be understood as predictions about how the world behaves based on the powers that are in nature. So for all these reasons, I think that causal powers are useful and important elements in our ontology. I think we should admit them, but I think we should admit them in our ontology with all this caution that I've tried to convey to you in my talk. So I'm one of these people who worked for a long time on causal powers, both in the history of metaphysics, so Aristotelian powers, and in contemporary metaphysics. And in a sense, I'm sharing with you what all this work has led me to think that yes, we want power, we want and need causal powers, but with a good understanding of what they do and they do not do for us, and what we can or cannot do with them. So I just say merci beaucoup. That's that causal powers. You know, does anybody want to say who among you has hearing this talk has decided causal powers? No, thank you. There are too many problems with them metaphysically, empirically, and so on. Yes, Lorenzo, you are among the skeptical. Yeah, anybody else? Oh no, so it's just a question.
To get clear on the notion of power.
Right. So who feels Humean in this room? I'm really curious. I always ask my students too. I want to understand if we powerful people, power metaphysicians are fighting a straw man, and everybody's positively convinced that powers are a useful addition to the ontology, or there are still many who think that it's simpler to be Humeans.
The students are not allowed to be human here. They are not allowed to be human.
They're not allowed.
Can you repeat it, because people, it's on, can you repeat it, because the people online didn't hear you. So
The people here are not allowed to be Humeans, Roger says. Interesting.
yeah, they sometimes pop up with their humism in my classes, but I
They get
will not
shut
quote
down.
them. So any questions?
I think Lorenzo was
Yeah.
the first.
Thanks a lot. It was brilliant, first of all. And yeah, I've got a trivial question, I think, but useful for me to ask. What difference do you make, if any, between power and disposition?
Good question.
Because
Sorry.
I mean, if I read, if I understand your powers in terms of dispositions, the question of their existence and of their role in explanation is a bit clearer to me. So first of all, as for their existence, do dispositions exist? I would say yes, with no doubt. The question is, how do we know that they exist? And there is, of course, disagreement about that. Some philosophers take dispositional properties to be evident, other not evident, knowable only by inference. And as for their total role, I mean, take salt and its property of being soluble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a certain amount of salt dissolved. Let's suppose that we explain that by saying that amount of salt is dissolved because it is salt is soluble. It is pretty clear that something seems to be missing for it to be a good explanation of what has happened. But my main point is, what is the difference between power and disposition?
Okay. Do you have an example in mind of each of the two? I mean, how do you want to start with telling me how you understand power and how you understand disposition, or I can tell you how I do understand them myself?
I thought that being soluble was an example of disposition, actually.
Okay.
And otherwise, there are some examples from Ryle, page 159 of his Concept of Mind.
Okay.
131, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
So, and the example is Fido, which tends to howl when the moon shines.
Okay. Okay, good. So let me just say a couple of things. So for present purposes, I spoke of powers, including capacities, dispositions, tendencies. I wanted to use a single word to cover a large range of examples. Partly because I wanted to make this talk accessible and interest to different people. In the contemporary literature on powers, there is a distinction made by some, not by all, where powers are sparse fundamental properties in nature. So mass, spin, and charge are powers. Everything else is derivative. So it's dispositional, but it's not fundamental. Here, I did not draw this distinction. I just took general to give lots of examples. So for present purposes, I use powers, disposition, capacity, tendency as synonymous. For my research, I think what powers really are, mass, spin, charge, sparse fundamental properties. But I think what you were thinking about was more, given the examples you gave, the difference between solubility and the disposition of the dog to bark, let's say, are examples of an active and a passive power. So solubility is the capacity of something to be dissolved in liquid. The disposition to bark is the disposition of something to be actively doing something. So if you are asking whether I believe there is a difference between active and passive powers, using the term generically, I think, well, as you know, as well as I do, Aristotle thinks there is. I think that there is a distinction of causal roles, but not the distinction in nature between active and passive, because powers can behave actively or passively depending on how, which role they're given in the system where they are embedded, or the perspective that we want to use to explain what's going on. So, yeah.
I mean, one important, I don't know whether this is really important, but one thing is the following. Dispositions are not usually taken to be primitive. I mean, you can analyze disposition actually by means of subjunctive conditional.
No. So I mean, yes, I understand what you're saying, but at least in the contemporary literature on powers, powers disposition tendencies have been all given a disposition analysis. So it's not a disposition analysis, conditional analysis goes only for dispositions. Has been tried to be extended to everything. It has failed for everything, or so we think. So I see what you're saying, but it's...
You mean that, I mean, you say that powers are not, are primitive.
Yeah.
Dispositions are not primitive.
No.
Because they're
analyzable. No, you see that, yeah, that's the thing that, so the disposition analysis is supposed to, the conditional analysis is supposed to apply to everything that is dispositional in nature. So powers and dispositions. Yeah. And I mean, you're right that there's been a long research program on whether powers could be explained away, or disposition could be explained away in terms of this conditional analysis. So, if you do this, that follows. But the current position in metaphysics, not just my own, is that this has not succeeded because there are too many adjustments to be made to the theory. So the theory becomes, too complex to be right. So that now, when post the conditional analysis, this metaphysical analysis holds both for powers and dispositions. You may say, yes, there is a difference. If there is a difference, it's in degrees of fundamentality. So powers are the real fundamental. But, and some metaphysicians think just like you, I do too in my research, but for present, but that's not the difference in terms of how we solve the problem. Or you can think some powers are active, some powers are passive. So solubility is passive, capacity to bark or disposition to bark is active, and that's another story. But yes, I see what you're saying, but I think it's more of a terminological matter than a substantial matter. Yeah, but thank you.
Je donne tout de suite la parole à Roger Puvet, mais notez, chers étudiantes et étudiants, que normalement la troisième question, c'est vous qui la posez. C'est pas moi qui détermine la règle, hein. C'est comme ça.
The first one is about, well, generally you say the power of something. Mm-hmm. But in your case, the power is primitive. It is not the power of something. So, you have an ontology of powers against an ontology of substances.
Can I answer that, or you want the other?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think that the problem is what are things in this case? Or if everything is, if you have only powers, things must be composed by powers.
These are excellent questions, Roger, so I'm very happy to speak about them. So yes, speaking for myself as a metaphysician, I think powers are fundamental entities in the ontology. By powers I mean these sparse fundamental properties, mass, spin, and charge. They are fundamental. They compose to give rise to objects. So I'm not an eliminativist about substances or objects, but I think, but I take them to be derivative by composition of powers. So in my system, there are both powers and the objects, but the objects are composed by powers. So what objects are, then there are, to your second question, so there is, it's not an either or, either there are powers or there are objects. For me, there are both, but powers first. Then I think you raised really a number of interesting issues with your question. So what are objects? Well, they are, if you wish to call them that way, bundles of causal powers. And then the question is what unifies them and what kind of collective powers they are over, and if they do, over and above the powers that compose them. And so there is a story to be said there. So I think there are powers that unify lower level powers into structures, and these structures can be bearers of further powers. So there are novel powers at the composition level.
So you have a mereological ontology.
Yes, in the sense that the fundamental building blocks are the powers, and the object or substances are derivative. They are derivative by unification of powers, and they're bearers of further powers. But I think what you, if I may say a bit more, I think what you ask is really interesting in another dimension. So normally we think precisely like you do, I think under an Aristotelian influence, that properties are types of entities that are born by objects. So they need to, they wouldn't exist unless they belong to some object, right? And often I get this type of question. So if I think that powers are properties and they're fundamental, can I still think of them as properties, even if there is nothing that they are properties of? And I think that's a really deep question. So I take that that's what you were thinking as well. And the answer that I want to give to that is that so I accept that powers are, as properties, are dependent entities. So they need, as it were, something else in order to be in the world. But I want to object to the idea that something else needs to be an object.
It can be primitive and dependent.
Yes, you know, in what sense? I mean, I'm really excited about this question because it's really interesting to me, very central to my research. They can be primitive in this, in the sense there is nothing else more fundamental than them, but their dependencies are not vertical, they are horizontal. So they are dependent on other powers. So basically, Roger, I'm imagining a world, I'm thinking that the world, the physical world as we know it, has these multiple fundamental physical powers that exist as interdependent. So they depend on each other, on structures they form by, and that's why I also call the theory of power structuralism. So they depend on other powers. So they're not dependent on something more fundamental, but they're dependent on something equally fundamental. And by understanding them this way, I think I kind of respect the traditional understanding of properties as dependent, but I make them dependent on other properties rather than a different type of entity, namely object. So I want to say, I think you really went at the core of my theory. Thank you very much for that. I don't know if that's the second question only.
You spoke about material causal powers, meaning, Michael. Do you think that they are non-material involved?
I think that's a great question again. So I think that there are physical causal powers. They may combine and give rise to matter, but that's a question mark, as something that I think I need to think more about. Yes, I think there are also non-physical causal powers, but they're not fundamental. So for example, you know, you have the power of thinking, you know, certainly, you know, it's a power that you have that need not be physical unless you're a physicalist about everything, you know. It's still a power. It's all that we have said applies to it, but it's not the fundamental power. So it's like derivative from physical powers that compose in a certain way. So say, I don't know, now I'm just going on a territory that I'm still working on myself, but I want to like propose the following picture. Think that there are fundamental physical powers structured in a certain way. The structure itself can bear novel powers and go up in levels of composition. At some point, there is a physical structure that is so complex that can bear mental powers, and that would be a living being, you know, a human being. So that's how I see it at the moment. But I think you're right that I'm very myself keen to try to understand how this, which rules of composition, if any, explain how we go from physical to material to mental. And maybe we don't, you know, I have not taken a position on that, but I think if the direction to go seems to me this, namely to think of composition and composition into structure that are more complex and can bear novelty. So thank you. That was both exciting questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can be free of the metaphor in ontology. How can we know that force is not just a projection of what we call a human wing? How can we escape from some kind of anti-realism with a non-trust into the metaphor? Because if we take the metaphor seriously and almost literally, power could be confronted with will. It will probably imply a destiny or God.
Yeah. So I think the question is complex, but I want to say, maybe you're thinking of the position according to which powers are directed towards their manifestation, like thoughts are directed towards objects in the world, and then the bearer of that power and the bearer of that thought are, you know, can will to do something. Okay, so you're thinking that way, that, you know, if that comparison between powers and intentionality holds true, then as much as we having intentional states do things because of those intentional states, powers having intentionality, physical intentionality, can will to do certain things. So I am skeptical, but I want to say, if you're interested in the question, there is really a wonderful new book coming out, the one I mentioned by William Bauer this year, which defends the idea that powers have physical intentionality, and therefore, you know, there is some mentality in the world, and mentality includes the will to do something. So I want to say it's not my special direction, it's not where I want to go, but some people have gone that way, and I am happy to maybe email you or give you the reference if you want to read more. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, Francois.
For a very nice talk. First, I'm quite frightened. You're replacing everything by force. My first query: do you consider that a magnet is ultimately made of powers and not of electrons whose power is to generate a magnetic field? I'm sure it is.
No, it's an excellent question. No, and it's an excellent question. I mean, these are really questions that I have with my, you know, debates I have with my colleagues. So thank you for bringing it up. I want to say that the magnet is constituted by electrons, each of which is constituted by causal powers. So you see, the delicate point, if I may, partly repeat what I was saying to Roger, is that I do not eliminate objects from the ontology. I just don't say that they are derivative. So it's like, you know, can I give you a metaphor that, I mean, it's a bit silly, but like imagine a box of Lego, you know, the thing for children, you know, you have with these little bricks. And with these little bricks, you build a castle, okay? So the castle is derivative because it's composed by the bricks, but it still exists, right? You know, so that's a picture of the world that I want to propose. So I don't want to eliminate the magnet. I just want to say that magnets, like the castle, is built after powers. And just to make it a little bit more familiar, if I may, in a sense, this it's a metaphysics of objects that goes in the direction of bundle theory. So, you know, like some metaphysicians traditionally, you know, have thought that objects are bundles of properties, either particular or universals. I'm going in that direction, only that for me, the properties are causal powers. So that's the novelty. So maybe you think of it that an object is a bundle. It's not eliminating it from the ontology. It's just saying we can give it a metaphysical analysis in these terms.
Okay. Okay. And if you allow a second,
please,
query,
of course, yeah.
You seem to imply at some point of your talk that we have to explain how power goes from inactive state to active state. And my query is the following: when a magnet attracts something, is it true that it becomes active? I would say that it has already generated a magnetic field, and when some object which is liable to be attracted is put in this field, well, there is attraction, but there is nothing new, nothing really changed.
Yeah.
It's only the way we conceive things in a kind of narrative. That's and it is the same with the theory of gravitation with Einstein. A mass does not attract, does not even modify the structure of the space-time, but the repartition of the masses is the structure of space-time, and nothing really happens.
I think this,
and we don't need anymore the activity or non-activity of the causal power.
I think this is a really interesting point that you're making. I take it really seriously, and here is how I think about it. I'm genuinely sharing work in progress, but I'm thinking that, if we think of power strictly speaking as the fundamental properties in nature, like mass, spin, and charge, I would tend to agree with you that at that level, they need to be always active. And then what happens is that there are different configurations and there is something changing. But that is, so then the question is, did they come to be? Did they come to exist directly active? Maybe, because we don't know how the universe came about. But I agree, it makes sense to me. I like that idea that we need to posit at the foundations of everything when we talk strictly speaking of the fundamental physical powers on which the universe is based as constantly active, and then their manifestation is literally a manifestation, so becoming visible of something, but not actually changing. But then the reason why I discussed all this problem is that we want to, if we think that there are not just those powers, but more complex, more derivative, less less physically fundamental powers, then I think we have a problem, because a glass doesn't break all the time, So I think it depends on which kind of powers you want to think about. And can I just say the last thing? I'm sorry for speaking so much, but I really enjoy your question. Even when we, even if we assume that in the world as it is, these fundamental powers are always active, we can still think of them as not active. And there is a conceptual distinction. And then that opens up the question,
If a power is not exerted by anything, but is a fundamental entity, I wonder how it is possible to think of it as non-active.
Well, but is that because the world is as it is? So here is the question, and we don't need to resolve it today, but here is, but here is the question to you. So is it that it is physically impossible that it will be inactive, or is it metaphysically impossible that it is inactive? And so I would agree with you that we can think that it's physically impossible for that power to be inactive. So I think you understand exactly what I mean, and I thank you for that. But then metaphysically, could we think, is there a metaphysical reason why it cannot be active? It's like 2 + 2 is 4, or is, this universe, gravity pulls us toward the center of Earth? What kind of necessity is there, when we think about them? So I hope we'll talk more, because that's really interesting. Thank you. But don't be frightened. It's a good picture of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's a question online, so I'll just ask the person online to ask their question, please.
I have a question. Good evening, Anna.
Hello, hi, good to see you.
Please, do you think that it is not necessary that there is an active power at first to reduce the other powers to be passive to active? Because if I am, suppose I am a man, I am a living being, I have power to think, but I must have the will to think before I think. Then I must have powers to mobilize other powers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it is possible to translate this schema to a physical one?
Thank you. This is an excellent question. And I don't know if you could hear the exchange we had here about the idea that the fundamental physical powers of the universe may need to be active. So we need to start, it's possible, it's even plausible that we need to think of the origins of everything from a set of already active causal powers. So yes, active first. But then the question that we're debating here is that if that necessity that these powers are always active at the foundation of things is a physical necessity or metaphysical necessity. So is it that because the world is as it is, that these powers happen to be perennially active at the bottom of everything, or is it a necessity that's stronger than that, a metaphysical necessity, such as, I don't know, 2 + 2 is 4. So I think the answer to your question is, I think yes, yes, we need to have active powers first, but necessity there needs to be disambiguated, I think, in terms of physical and metaphysical necessity, and there is work to be done there. So maybe it's not inconceivable to think that even the fundamental powers were first non-active. It's just that it is physically impossible to think of our world as being what it is unless those powers have been active from the start.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. So we have another question from a student in the room. So I'm just going to invite you, Matthew, to ask your question, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just curious about your approach on time, because for what I understand, time is a very important component of the theory, because and you seem to say that the most primordial aspect of the work is power, and I'm just curious to know what is the relationship between this power and time, and does it have a spatial ontology of time? And
yeah, that's a fantastic question. Okay, it's a really difficult one. So let me just clarify a little bit the dialectic. So according to this German philosopher Bachmann, there is an either or. Either we have power or we have time. And I say, well, that is because he has a certain understanding of powers as producers of change. And from that understanding, he derives incompatibilities between powers and any theory of time. Now, I don't think he's right. And there are other people who wrote papers on this topic. So, you know, if you're interested, I can give you a couple of things to look at. So I don't think he's right. I think he's not right in his understanding of powers. But other people have written papers saying he's not right in thinking there is an incompatibility between his understanding of powers and understanding of time. So that's the debate. I want to say that I said semi-seriously that I choose powers if I have to choose between powers and time for the following reason, because I think, and this is work in progress for me, Mackie. So, you know, I say something, I say as much as I have to say, but I know there is more to be said. I think that we can underpin time by powers rather than vice versa. And that is something really interesting if true. So that's not something that I have a proof for, but I think, you know, we want to think about what is time, what is the passage of time? Could we think that it is not primitive, but possibly explainable in terms of causal powers, which are the real primitive of everything? And how is that done? Well, the question is, to know how this is done, we need to understand how, whether powers are internally complex entities, such that there is a before and after that is more fundamental than the before and after of time. But I say honestly here that it's fascinating for me to think about it, but I've not done the work to prove that we can reduce time to powers. It's just really interesting to see if it works or if it doesn't work. But if you're interested in the question of the out between power and time, it's really interesting. Literally last year and the year before, maybe 5 or 6 papers came up on the topic. Lots of people were thinking about it. So I'm happy to share with you and Manuel if you want to know more. It's a fascinating question. So thank you. And I'm sorry I don't have all the full answer.
Thank you.
But since we are talking about time, I think that Manuel wanted to add something on his side, but he will need the mic.
Or you can speak loudly.
No, because we need it for the recording,
Okay.
otherwise it's not going
Okay.
to be recorded. So, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question concerning time and motion. You have already answered it. So, but I have a second question concerning your answer to Roger. We consider powers the most fundamental level of reality. We consider structural powers, different kinds, sorry, structural powers, substantial powers. Some structural powers which eventually can bring out the substantial powers. My question is, where could we find oneness, which is a property crucial in the most a vast majority of metaphysical theories?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question, although I think my answer is going to sound controversial. Okay, so I think that it's not difficult to find physical oneness in the world, i.e. there are structures of physical causal powers that are interconnected with each other, and therefore they generate unities, where the unity is accounted for by the interconnections, the causal interconnections among powers. Okay, so as to physical unity, I think we can give an explanation of it. So like this table, this computer, let's say, is a physical unity because there is a bundle of powers, to use that term, that causally interact with each other. They serve as manifestation partners for each other, and that is a physical unity. So where unity depends on causal interactions. But the answer then becomes, or the question, and then the answer becomes difficult and the answer controversial when we talk about metaphysical unity. Because, say, an Aristotelian would say, oh, you know, it is a computer because it's a token of a type computer, it is an instance of the type. I think the question is much harder than that. I think that there's literally no metaphysical reason to think that this is one or many. In this sense, I'm a Louisian. So this that can be a computer or computer parts. And what's it that settles the question? Is it one or many, metaphysically speaking, not physically speaking? And I think we can settle the question, and I'm happy to say how I think we can, but it's in the following way. So if suppose that I'm an anthropologist, I walk into this room, I'm interested in metaphysical unities such as human beings, because that's the object I'm interested in studying as an anthropologist. Okay, but suppose I am a particle physicist, I enter this room, I'm interested in a much deeper level of reality, so I don't care about human beings as unities here, I look at particles, you know. So I count, when I enter the room as an anthropologist, I count, I don't know how many human beings here. When I enter a room as a physicist, I count so many particles in this room. So every human being for the physicist is not one thing, it's all these many particles, but for the anthropologist, one thing. So basically, I'm saying that the metaphysical number of things is determined by the kind of concept that we use to identify things, and that kind of concept is determined by the kind of physical inquiry or scientific inquiry that we're making when we are counting.
Is it possible still to be a realist?
It's a great question too. Yeah, it's a great question too. But if I may, I want to give a nuanced answer. So it depends on what you mean by realist. So yes, realist about entities in the world, the powers and the structures. Yes, realist about rules of inquiry. So there are sciences, you know, and they have rules and they're real, you know, we are committed to them. Maybe also we can be realist by allowing a certain portion of reality to be counted differently. So the portion of reality is real, but the multiple ways we count it are multiple, although they are objective. So it's not what remains real are the powers and the structure that is solid, you know, like a solid piece of realism. what is open is how we count them. So I basically say, I want to say we bestow number upon nature, but we don't thereby create nature. Nature is there, you know, it's this number of powers, this number of structures, but we give it a number, one or many, depending on the science we're interested in when we investigate the portion of reality.
There are no essences.
Yes. So yes, I'm not an old-fashioned Aristotelian in that sense. So so I want to object to that. To essentialism in this particular way, Roger. I want to say that it's not true that the number of things correspond to a sorta. So it's not true one sorta, one thing, because to the same portion of reality we can apply different sortas and then different numbers. So yes. So yes, well, as you all know, I started out as an Aristotelian, but I'm finding, you know, my own way of thinking about things, which still keeps some Aristotelian elements as central in the thinking, for example, causal powers, but also, you know, moves away from Aristotle in lots of ways. So yes, I think now I now think that the label neo-Aristotelian doesn't seem right, you know, for me or in general, you know, who can be exactly a neo-Aristotelian, but Aristotle can be an inspiration. So yes, I mean, you're both right in a number of ways. I'm not following Aristotle, but I hope that's good. I mean, it's creative at least.
Wonderful. Emanuele wanted to make a follow-up.
Sorry, if you have talked in terms of number and counting, and this I have thinking the Greek term arithmos, but there is another different term, n1. I can think that number and counting, I can eventually agree with that, but oneness, n, this Greek term, following Aristotle, oneness goes with being, so in a certain way, being a computer is being one, and the oneness which belongs to computer and the oneness which belongs with a force, if you are talking with a force, the oneness, I don't know if.
Well, I mean, without making to whether it would be arithmos or n, I want to say that yes, there are physical unities. Like a horse is a physical unit. It's like a structure of powers causally interconnected. That's one physical unity. But whether it is one thing or many, well, it's one horse if you're interested in certain things about the world, or it's multiple, I don't know, even horse parts or particles, even if you're interested about other things about the world. So it's the number, I divide number and unity. So physical unity, yes. What I call metaphysical unity, no, it can be multiple. I mean, I have some new papers on this topic too, where I'm thinking that maybe we can never give the number one to anything. I mean, although things can be physically unified. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more on some other occasion about it. Thank you. Your questions are all wonderful. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much. There is a question online. Madame Kijevich wanted to ask her question, so please do. And then I see that Hugo also wants to ask a question.
Thank you very much for both. Hello, so my name is Višnja Knežević, and I'm a research associate at the Institute for Philosophy in Belgrade, University of Serbia. So, nice to meet you. Okay, my field of interest is ancient Greek philosophy, and I thought that I could contribute a bit. I find your talk very inspiring, and peculiarly it's in line with some of the debates we have in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly with the pre-Socratics. It's also, are the objects, or are we talking about the powers, etc.? So it's very close to me. So I would perhaps suggest as I understood your explanation, your metaphysical explanation, I would rather suggest to go beyond or before Aristotle, because I think that you will find many interesting things in the Hippocratics. The concept of power, how you are explaining it, is rather closer to the Hippocratic and Alcmaeonian concept of power than to the Aristotelian. Or if we're talking about Aristotle, then maybe Aristotle from Generation of Animals. Why am I saying that? Not just, to say, no, this is not right or this is right, because with the Hippocratic concept of power and the Alcmeonian concept of power, we don't have the problem active versus inactive. So we have activity all the time, and then we can talk about what we perceive as inactive, but is active, or we can perhaps introduce the concept of balance. The concept of balance then perhaps could be connected with inactivity. So what we perceive as inactive, or when powers are inactive, they are de facto in balance. Okay, that was one thing. The second thing, this would be my question in line with the previous discussion, is when we're talking about number and unity, would you be, how would you then react to the problem of infinity? Would it be the problem of objective realm? I'm talking about mathematical infinity, because when we have plurality of power, then naturally emerges the question of their number. So would the problem of potential infinity or infinity be the problem of the objective, which will be solvable in objective, but not the problem of the real, of the metaphysical, or will it be also the problem of the metaphysical? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so it's interesting that you brought up the early Greek philosophers, and I forgot to mention that before, but certainly a number of ancient Greek philosophers before Aristotle thought of powers entirely differently, so thought that powers are always active, and maybe the most controversial but interesting example is Plato himself, who thinks that the forms, Plato in the Sophist, Lorenzo can relate to that. Plato in the Sophist says that all there is dunamis, namely power. But if the forms are powers, then we know that the forms are not changing. So how can the form be powers? They need to be powers that they never change from from inactive to active. So I think that's the most interesting case of an ancient example of powers that are always active and never go from inactive to active. So yes, there are different conceptions of powers in antiquity, but the question remains whether, in contemporary, there are different questions, like there is historical record that some people thought that way. Then the question is that way of thinking helpful for us metaphysicians today? As to the second question, so in the world as it is, I think that the world was, let's say, created, generated, came to be with set of number of powers. So not infinite at the bedrock, but some. But it's an open question whether the world is, as we say in English, atomic or ganky. So I don't know if gank is a word that translates in French in an interesting way, but it's can I just briefly give you the explanation as we have it? David Lewis in the 70s started talking about gank or ganky objects as those objects that have parts that have parts that have parts. So it's basically something is ganky when it is unlimitedly divisible into parts. The question is, though, whether, that's ambiguous between possibly divisible or actually divided into unlimited many parts. There are two different versions of the story. One can think that the universe is ganky, no problem, never gets divided. So, there is no actual infinity. Even Aristotle would be happy with that. But if we mean actually ganky, that namely everything as a part and as a part of it as a part, then if the fundamental building blocks of the world are powers and they are ganky, they are infinite, but not in types, but in number of parts. So I think that as science is today, we're open to the possibility that the world may be ganky. If it is ganky, for me, it's power ganky, basically, or ganky power at the bottom. And then, of course, one can ask whether ganky is, can we make sense of it? But yes, I think we can, and that's a long, different story.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ugo, you want to ask the very last question, please?
Sorry.
Okay. So I wanted to come back to the idea that at least some objects may be difficult to isolate and constitute as unities in metaphysics. I wanted to know if that difficulty could contaminate also powers. For example, if the magnetism of magnets, for example, may be something that could become hard to isolate as one power.
That's a really great question. So thank you. Can I want to make a small clarification, but it's not important to the core of your question. So I don't want to say that we may have difficulties. I just think that we have different ways of numbering things, and that's not bad. It may be good, you know. But I think then you're asking me, so if we have different ways of numbering things, does that apply to powers as well? So can we count one power? And I want to say yes, for the following reason, that the multiple ways of counting or giving oneness to something apply to things that are complex. But the fundamental powers are each one, you know, so and so they're not complex with many parts, and then we can ask whether they're one or many. But it's an excellent question, so thank you for that. Can I just say, Anna, before we finish, I just want to say, especially for the graduate students, I am really grateful for the discussion today. And if you wanted to ask a question and there was no time, you can email me. I'm very happy to try to answer questions by email. I really love these topics, and I was not sure how lay or specialized the audience was, but I think you guys are just so specialized and so much into things. So I just loved it. Thank you very much. So I don't know if, I mean, my email address is very simple. It's my first name, Anna, dot, my surname, which is Marmodoro, as you see in the advertisement of the talk, dot, okay, sorry, at, and then it's philosophy, dot, and then AC, AC for academia, dot.
We'll Google it.
Let's Google it. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I'm still spelling like the old, like dinosaurs. I'm still spelling things. Sorry, I mean that's for my age. Sorry, guys.
But indeed, you are back here to France in May, right?
Yes.
So maybe you should do some.
We should do it again. Yes. Could have a nice workshop or something. But yes, wonderful.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. It was really.